So I was taking a look at the new 5-star sword. Low base attack, high crit rate, HP to attack conversion. It's basically a stat stick. But which sword unit benefits from a stat stick? Oh, who am I kidding? You all read the title. Let's just roll the intro. What's up folks, CrushSG here, and I told you I'd see you real soon. So the Primordial Jade Cutter is the new 5-star sword on the current weapon banner with the Jade Spear. When it was first leaked a few weeks back, it drew lots of attention because of its unusual stat distribution. With high crit rate, low base attack, and a HP secondary, one naturally wonders who can best use this weapon. HP bonus with a HP to attack conversion. Xingqiu and Bennett come to mind since both of them have something in their kit that scales with HP. But thinking about it a little more, Bennett favors weapons with high base attack stats for his buff. Xingqiu does better with a weapon that either buffs his E-skill or gives him energy recharge for burst uptime. None of the other sword units scale with HP, so that naturally leaves us with Albedo. Crush, you are aware that Albedo doesn't scale with HP, right? Well, yeah, of course I know that, but he does have a decent base HP stat, and more importantly, his Transient Blossoms, arguably his most important skill, scales with his defense. This is precisely why the Harbinger of Dawn is one of the best weapons for Albedo. When you have split scaling to that degree, the single best way to scale his damage is via crit stats, because crit stats scales universally with his entire kit. And at 28% crit chance and 46.9% crit damage, the Harbinger is almost a perfect stat stick for him. Almost being the key word, of course. First, we have the pesky 90% HP requirement, which isn't a huge issue most of the time, but can certainly be an issue if you run Bennett for heals, or don't run a healer at all and happen to get hit. Next, we still can't ignore the fact that half of Albedo's kit still does scale with attack, and the measly 401 base attack on the Harbinger doesn't do it any favors. It also just feels weird that a 3-star weapon is almost conclusively better than any 4 or 5-star weapon for a 5-star unit. I mean, there's always the Festering Desire or Blackcliff Longsword, but I've already shown the math behind why they are largely inferior to the Harbinger of Dawn. So what about the Jade Cutter then? Well, let's have a look. It caps out at 542 base attack, gives 44.1% crit rate, and increases HP by 20%, and also converts 1.2% of the wielder's max HP to attack, unconditionally. Sparing you the boring details, I can tell you right off the bat that we don't even need a spreadsheet to tell us that the Harbinger still has more theoretical DPS potential, assuming you are above 90% HP and only use his E-skill. Why? Simple. Stat weight. The Harbinger of Dawn gives 28% crit rate and 46.9% crit damage. This gives a total stat weight of 51.5% crit rate versus the 44.1% on the Jade Cutter. This means with enough optimization, you'd theoretically be able to squeeze out more DPS from the Harbinger. Now I did say assuming we only used his E-skill though, and this is where things get interesting, because you'd still use Albedo's burst whenever it comes up, and at a 40 energy cost, his burst is up almost on cooldown. Also, the Jade Cutter directly addresses the two main issues the Harbinger has. It doesn't have a HP requirement, and despite having a lower than normal base attack, it still has 141 more base attack than the Harbinger does. Add the bonus HP conversion into the equation and my Albedo gains an additional 256 attack for a total sheet attack bonus of about 400. But can all of this make up for the difference in the crit rate stat weight that I talked about earlier? Let's head over to my spreadsheet. Those who watch my Albedo videos should be familiar with this table. Just a quick breakdown and I'll squish it for easier reading. This table compares the DPS potential between an R5 Harbinger of Dawn with both an R1 and an R5 Jade Cutter. These stats are based on a level 90 C0 and C2 Albedo, using my Albedo's current gear with optimized crit stats for each weapon as always. Of course, we have the HP values for the Jade Cutters because of its bonus, and we are using level 6 skill modifiers across the board. This is the defense scaling for C2 calculation, mob base resistance, and mob mitigation. These are the average damage per hit values taking crit rate into consideration, and these are the DPS values for C0 and C2. Naturally, the higher the total DPS, the better. Lastly, as I did in my other Albedo videos, I assumed that half the Fatal Blossoms hit the target per burst rotation on average. Okay, let's get rid of all the unnecessary stuff. And here we have it. We can see that the Jade Cutter does indeed bring more overall DPS than the Harbinger of Dawn at both C0 and C2. 7.5% more damage at R1, 17.3% more damage at R5 for C0, and understandably less for C2 because the added defense scaling somewhat dilutes the value of attack. Oh yeah, for those wondering about how it fares with Albedo as a carry, I didn't do the calculations for it due to time constraints, but I can tell you that based on the many Albedo calculations I've done in previous videos, you will gain even more DPS from the Jade Cutter in carry builds, simply because the normal attacks scale off attack and you'll be using your Isotoma pretty much on cooldown in a carry rotation, thus benefiting more from the cast damage of the Isotoma, which also scales with attack. And of course, naturally, if you're actually running an attack Albedo for some reason, obviously the Jade Cutter benefits from that too. Finally, a new best-in-slot weapon for Albedo, right? Well, maybe, but there are a couple of considerations. Bringing back the extended DPS tables, we see that the Harbinger does still bring more transient Blossom DPS across the board. So in a way, you could say that the Jade Cutter makes up for all its DPS via Isotoma cast damage and burst damage. This means if you don't have a habit of using your Isotoma and bursts on cooldown within your rotation, you may not see much gains at all going from the Harbinger to the Jade Cutter, or might even lose damage. I also assumed half the Fatal Blossoms hit the target, so you should expect to gain less value from the Jade Cutter in scenarios where there are less enemies on the field because chances of multi-blossom hits drops. The opposite is also true, of course, and you'll gain much more value in mobbing scenarios. Alright folks, let's wrap things up. So it does look like we finally have a non-3-star weapon with best-in-slot potential for Albedo. It brings more DPS at R1, and you make these gains while ridding yourself of the 90% HP requirement on the Harbinger, opening up more options for teammates. It's also nice to see a weapon that actually shows any gains at all compared to the Harbinger for a support Albedo, because prior to this it wasn't much of a fight, honestly. That said, for those of you who are thinking that a 7.5% damage gain is hardly worth the money, especially going from a 3-star to a 5-star weapon, you would be right in thinking so. This is not a necessary nor a good value upgrade by any stretch, folks. It's one of those scenarios where I'd say use it if you happen to get one as pull collateral. It's an upgrade, but don't sweat it if you don't get one. Nonetheless, it's still something interesting that I wasn't expecting in 1.3, so I thought I'd share it with you anyway. And that's it for today, folks. Thumbs if you liked it, crush that subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one.